Welcome back to the Europeans. We are coming to you this week from Paris and Warsaw. Hello, producer Wojciech.
Hello, how are you?
I'm good. How are you? Nice to have you in front of the microphone this week while Dominic's away singing.
Yeah. I always feel a bit stressed trying to step into his big boots, big shoes, you say, rather.
He has got very large feet.
Yeah, that's true. But excited. Really cool to be here.
So how are things over there in Poland? I hope things are getting better after the terrible floods we've seen over the past week or so.
Yeah, so as you may have seen in the news, almost entire southwestern Poland was flooded. And you've probably heard the news about Storm Boris all over, so I won't repeat any of these, but I just wanted to say that it's really devastating to watch and hear about it when you actually live in the country and see people suffering.
Yeah.
Especially that one of my friends, he lives in Nysa with his family, and that's a city that was just completely overwhelmed by a tide. And I finally got to speak to him, and it's like really unimaginable to find yourself in such a situation. His entire flat was still 2 meters below the water surface when we talked.
Oh my God.
Yeah, like he only managed to evacuate his family and a few personal belongings, and everything is like gone for good.
Oh, that's so awful.
Yeah, so, he's fine and his family is fine. They moved with the close family who were lucky to have a house on the top of a hill. But I would like to use this occasion to ask everyone to be like really careful and never underestimate warnings about storms and tides. There will likely be more and more of them in the future, also in the areas where they were never to be seen. And we can really minimize the threat and losses by acting as early as possible. It's just so important. And also, if you only can afford it, just remember about insuring the place you live in. It actually costs not that much, but just hearing him talk about things, it would provide such a massive comfort for him, where he could only just focus on taking care of his closest ones, rather than, also be worrying all the time about your material situation. So yeah, not a big fan of insurance companies, but, pick a one that is least controversial and think about making it safer for you and your family.
Yeah, I think sadly, insuring all of our stuff against the extreme weather that's going to be becoming more and more frequent in the years to come because of climate change is sadly something that we're all going to have to think about.
Yeah, I think so. From sort of like a broader standpoint, that much you can do as a private person, except for, asking your politicians to do something about it, because there's things that can be done which are very unpopular. But, you just have to probably count on yourself to a great extent.
These things have to be done. Staying in Poland, we've got a great interview coming up later in the show. And I believe you actually know our guest, Wojciech, from a former life.
That's so funny. Yeah, from my 2 former lives. So today we're calling Paweł Zerka, the author of the European Sentiment Compass. It's a very insightful report that goes deep into why not all Europeans are psyched to vote in European elections. And also he talks about what can be done about it. But the fun fact is that midway through booking him for the show, I realized that we went to the same high school in Warsaw, but also I once booked his band for a show when I used to be a concert promoter, which was very funny. It was like 12 years ago. I barely remembered him, but we had a very nice chat after all these years.
That's so nice. Looking forward to hearing that later in the show. But first up, it's Good Week, Bad Week.
Good week, bad week.
So, a little surprise for you, listeners. In a historic first, we have someone joining us for a special guest edition of Good Week, Bad Week, calling in from Dusseldorf in Germany. It's Kate Laycock from Deutsche Welle. Hi, Kate.
Hello. I'm very, very excited to be here, Katie. Long-time listener, first-time caller.
Welcome.
I think you've actually been listening since episode 2 or 3 of the Europeans.
I
Is that
really
right?
do think it goes back that far. Yeah, but I am, as I said, I am completely your target audience.
In what sense?
Well, in that I'm very much Europhile. I live in Germany. I have a semi-French family. I work in European news. I mean, yeah, you couldn't really get more target audience than me, to be honest.
And you're also, in fact, a European podcaster yourself. So the reason you're here is that you are the host of Inside Europe, which is a fantastic podcast and radio show from Germany's public broadcaster, Deutsche Welle. And we're actually going to be guests on Inside Europe next week, Dominic and me, which is very exciting.
You are. It's a bit of a mutual loving, isn't it?
It is. Disgusting. This week, though, since we've just had elections in Germany, Kate, we thought you would be the perfect person to talk through what's just happened in the state of Brandenburg over the weekend. So I'm going to ask you the big question. Who has had a good week?
So I have to give good week to Dietmar Woidke, who is the minister-president in Brandenburg. He's been the minister-president since 2013. He's a social democrat. And basically, Katie, he's pulled a blinder. So what happened was the AfD, so the far-right party, was way ahead of the polls. I mean, it seemed like they had a lead that nobody was ever going to catch up on. And what he did was said, right, you know what, guys? It's me or the AfD, right? So if the AfD comes top, if my party does not come top of the elections, then I'm going to step away. You won't see me. Even if we manage to get a coalition together to keep out the AfD, you won't see me as your minister-president anymore. He was very popular. There was a perception that, he'd done a good job. People trusted him. And so what happened was, basically, the anti-AfD vote all went to him. He managed to come ahead of the AfD. His party, the SPD, came ahead of the AfD. It is a bit of a Pyrrhic victory, however, because so successful was his strategy that key potential coalition partners, like crucially the Green Party, actually lost so many votes that they did not make it over the 5% threshold to get into the regional parliament. Yeah, exactly. So he's now in a bit of a sticky place because the only possible coalition partners that he could have would be the Christian Democrats. They really don't want to do that. So that leaves Bundessache Wagenknecht, which is a rather turbulent and unpredictable new kid on the block. So we're not out of the woods yet, but on a personal level, absolutely a good week for him. Olaf Scholz, the German Chancellor, that's a bit less clear because although, of course, it is a victory for his Social Democrat Party, part of this strategy was, of course, making the election completely about Dietmar Woidke. And even though Olaf Scholz actually lives in Brandenburg, Dietmar Woidke very studiously managed not to be seen in public with the Chancellor for the whole of the campaign.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I mean, what does it say about Olaf Scholz's popularity, or rather unpopularity, that this other guy won specifically by ignoring him?
Yeah, it's not good news. It's nothing that we didn't know already. Whether you listen to criticism from the left or the right, or indeed from his own party, the refrain tends to be similar, and that is, we want leadership, and we don't see that happening. To be fair to Olaf Scholz, he's in a three-way coalition, and so compromise and keeping the wheels running was very much part of, I think, what he saw his mission as being. But we're heading into a year next year where we have federal elections coming up, and with the coalition in a sort of constant state of bickering and paralysis, Olaf Scholz has to now really develop his own profile and the profile of his own party.
Do you know what worries me a bit? It's another case of anti-far-right politician, pulling off this emotional blackmail trick where, like, it's me or the far-right. I wonder how many times it will work in the future.
Well, that's a key question. If not the key question, it worries me too.
Because it feels like that's how we've been voting in France for years and years already, right? People have been voting against something rather than for a party that they actively feel really enthusiastic about. And it just doesn't really feel very sustainable.
Yeah, no, the French example, Katie, was definitely the one that I had in mind.
I know you're giving good week to this guy, Dietmar Woidke, but I do want to ask you about somebody else who you mentioned had done pretty well in these elections in Brandenburg, which is Sarah Wagenknecht, who is a kind of left-wing conservative, if that's a thing. I find her politics to be very interesting. Can you tell us briefly about who she is and what she stands for?
I'm going to commit, Katie, I think, a cardinal sort of European sin here. I'm going to use a very, very British example to explain a German phenomenon. Is that okay? Bear with me. She's Marmite. So Marmite, basically, it's a breakfast spread. And the campaign slogan for years has been, you either love it or you hate it. And she very much inspires that reaction amongst people. So she has been a leading figure in Die Linke, so the left party, for a long time. But she's broken away to create her own party called the Bundessaare Wagenknecht. As you can probably tell from the title, it's very much centred around her and her personal brand, which is a very strong personal brand. She's a very, very popular guest on talk shows, for example. But, how long can something like that hold together if it is focused around the personality and politics of one person? That's an open question. In terms of those politics, they're also very, very tricky for other parties to deal with because she's combining a very, very typically left-wing position on things like the economy and social questions with a stance which is against arming Ukraine, for more peace with Russia, but also very, very sharp rhetoric on things like migration and also topics that come under the sort of the broad culture wars sort of rubric. So she's combining a messaging which seeks to resonate with an AfD voter base, but combining it with left-wing social and economic policy.
Okay, so Dietmar Woidke has had a good week. This Sarah Wagenknecht person has also had a pretty good week. Haven't the AfD also tried to spin this as being really quite a good week for them, even though they didn't end up winning these elections?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, they came a narrow second and, they say they are the party of the future. And if you look at these state-level results, then, yeah, absolutely, it was the young people that were voting for them. If it weren't for the over 60s, we'd be looking at a very different result. And it's given them wind in their sails, I suppose. I mean, if you were to look at the footage coming out of their after party, it was jubilant. There was dancing to, for example, a song which goes, the German is, Hey, jetzt geht's ab, wir schieben sie alle ab, which translates as, hey, let's go, we're going to deport them all, or sort of, hey ho, we're going to make them go. So, that was the atmosphere.
Well, that feels like a really cheery place to end this good week. Thanks, Kate.
Can we do bad week now?
Yeah, let's move on to the even cheerier news of bad week.
So, Katie, does this mean that I get to ask you what your bad week is? Is that how the programme works?
You absolutely do. You have been listening a long time.
Well, I know, but I'm suddenly all self-conscious now that I actually get to talk to you. Okay, so Katie, who this week in Europe has been having a really bad time? Who are you giving bad week to?
I'm going to give my bad week to books and book lovers in Slovakia and the Netherlands, because both of these countries have just announced that they are slapping much higher taxes on books. Let's start with Slovakia, where the government has announced that it is increasing the value-added tax, or VAT, that is applied to books. It's going to go from 10% to 23%. Why, I hear you ask? Well, according to the finance minister, Ladislav Kamenitsky, the government's own analysis suggests that books are something that are primarily bought by rich people. So this is a progressive tax and a good idea. How do you guys feel about this policy?
No.
Wonderful.
It's terrible, isn't it? So, but hang on, Slovakia, right? So this is Robert Fico. He's got form in attacking the culture sector.
He really does. And that's something I want to talk about again in a minute. But there have been some quite funny posts on TikTok this week with Slovaks showing off their bookshelves with baller gangster music in the background, celebrating just how rich they must be to own these things. Obviously, it goes without saying that this claim that books are primarily bought by rich people is questionable. The Slovak National Publishers Association have disputed it. They say that books are primarily bought by middle-income people, but there are also some big exceptions to that. Pensioners, for example, buy lots and lots of books. But yeah, even if it was true, surely raising the tax on them makes books even less affordable for the less wealthy people. And doesn't that seem like a bad thing? Books are very obviously good for society. They help us better understand the world or escape to new ones. They help us learn new skills. And that's why the VAT on books in most European countries is below the standard rate. And in some of them, like Ireland and Denmark and Czechia, for example, it's actually zero.
Yeah, and I mean, if this we're going to be combined with but what we're going to do is we're going to make books accessible to everybody because we're going to have mass investment in public library infrastructure, for example, then yeah, okay. But this is not really about that, is it?
No, it doesn't seem to have been very well thought out. The tax hike is part of a wider shake-up of tax policy that is happening because the government is trying to find ways of bringing its deficit down. But as the Publishers Association have pointed out, the Slovak book market, it's not especially huge, so this isn't going to earn a huge amount of money for the government anyway. What it is likely to do is really hurt the book industry. So Latvia actually did something similar back in 2009. They raised the VAT on books from 5% to 21%. And the move only lasted 8 months in the end because it was just so disastrous. Book sales plummeted, publishers had to fire a bunch of people. So it doesn't really seem like a great idea.
No. Can I quote Ursula Le Guin, because she's one of my favourite authors? So there have been great societies that did not use the wheel, but there have been no societies that did not tell stories.
Love it.
There you go. So going back to what you were saying about Robert Fico's populist government and culture generally, quite a lot of commentators are seeing this book tax in Slovakia as part of a wider crackdown on the culture sector. So the culture minister is this very right-wing former TV presenter called Martina Šimkovičová. Since last month, she has fired the head of the National Theatre, the National Gallery and the National Library. She's also tried to get the public broadcaster put under state control.
Yes, something that, as you can imagine, Katie, my colleagues and I at Deutsche Welle have been watching very closely because, of course, we're aware that, there but for the grace of the electorate go we.
Right, exactly. You guys are also, of course, a public broadcaster. Already the situation in Slovakia is drawing comparisons with what happened to culture under Viktor Orban in Hungary, where the government used this mix of censorship and cutting off funding to make it incredibly difficult in the end to make any form of art that went against their nationalist agenda. So it's something that I think we want to come back to and discuss more on this podcast, this cultural crackdown in Slovakia, because it is rather alarming. Just a little ray of light at the end of the tunnel. There are some tentative signs that the government could backtrack on this book tax. Even some figures from the far-right SNS party, which is part of Fico's coalition, have said that they think this is a bad idea. So the government has indicated that it may revisit this policy, which in any case would have to be approved by Parliament. So the Slovak book tax could potentially be scrapped. We'll have to see if the same could be true in the Netherlands, where the right-wing government there has just unveiled a new budget that again increases the VAT on books. They're set to go from being taxed at the reduced rate of 9% to the standard rate of 21%, along with quite a few other things that people enjoy, namely tickets for plays and concerts, access to gyms, stays in hotels. And just like in Slovakia, this has caused a huge outcry from people that work in those sectors. There was a pretty striking protest in The Hague a few days ago where the protesters unrolled this huge banner, like meters and meters long, and hung it from the roof of the book museum. And this banner was designed to look like a receipt from a shop, and it listed all of the costs to society that taxing these things will bring, even if it does bring in a bit of money to the government's coffers. It's things like an estimated 1.5 million fewer visits to festivals, 4 million fewer books sold every year, hundreds of thousands of people cancelling their subscriptions to news websites, which is obviously just what we need in the middle of a media funding crisis. Dominic mentioned when we were chatting about this that Geert Wilders, the leader of the biggest coalition partner, the PVV, he regularly criticises the media for being too left-wing and too critical of him. So it's quite eyebrow-raising that the government are pushing this policy that will slash the revenues of these media outlets that don't like Wilders very much.
It's almost as though knowledge is power, isn't it?
It almost is.
So could you tell us what's the justification behind it?
So as with Slovakia, this is being justified on the basis of the money that the government wants to bring in. They say that these VAT increases will bring in 2.2 billion euros a year from 2026. It is worth noting, in their manifesto before they got elected, the PVV wanted to cut the amount of public funding going to the arts sector to literally zero. So it's fair to say that they are quite dismissive of the benefits of the arts to society. But, as Dominic pointed out to me, the benefits of these things that are about to be taxed more, they're not just these intangible things about making people more educated, making people happier. They also contribute in a very real way to the economy. So if 1.5 million fewer tickets are sold for festivals, you're going to see businesses suffer from that. And if people do less sport and the workforce becomes less healthy, that also has a knock-on effect. The budget is being discussed in the Dutch Parliament as we speak. You would hope that politicians in both Slovakia and the Netherlands are going to see sense and realise that no one really gains from raising the taxes on books. But we're going to have to wait and see.
Can I give a shout out to a friend in Finland whose idea of utopia is a world in which we've swapped the state arts budget with the military budget?
Great idea. Elect this person. Thank you so much for joining us, Kate.
It's been amazing. Well, this is one of my favourite segments in the show, so I feel really privileged to have been able to join you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we're very much looking forward to coming on Inside Europe next week. If you like the Europeans, you will definitely enjoy Inside Europe, so you'll find a link to it in the show notes. We have reached that point in the episode where we bang on about how much work we do to make this podcast each week and how little money we have to make it. Because there is so much stuff that we would love to make for you if we had more money. Cool stuff that would be enjoyable for your ears. More investigative podcasts, more deep dives, more weird and wonderful mini-series. But at the moment, we are just covering our costs. So if you enjoy the show, we would love it if you could help us to dream a little bit bigger than that by chipping in and sending a little money our way via patreon.com. The link is right there on that tiny little screen in your hand. It's patreon.com/Europeans podcast. And Wojciech, I know that you always love thanking our newest supporters when you're here. So would you like to do the honors?
Yeah, that's actually the only reason why I'm still working with you. So this week we would like to thank from the bottom of our hearts to Maria, Matthias, Cindy, and Mick. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, everyone. One of the things that I really like about this podcast is that sometimes we zoom in really close on a certain issue and sometimes we zoom all the way out. And last week we zoomed in pretty much as close as you can and we talked about testicles. This week, something very different than testicles. We're going to zoom out again and try and take a bird's eye view of this continent and where it's headed. And one thing that I found really helpful in trying to do that over the past couple of years is a report called the European Sentiment Compass. It's produced by the European Council on Foreign Relations, which is the think tank, in collaboration with our friends at the European Cultural Foundation. And this report tracks how people across the EU feel about the EU. The last couple of editions have looked at how the war in Ukraine and COVID have changed how people feel about Europe. The latest report, which came out just yesterday, focused on the European elections, which took place in May. And specifically, it looks at why a lot of people didn't vote in these elections, a few specific groups in particular. It's a really, really interesting report. So we thought, why not ring up the person who wrote it? Especially since, Wojciech, it turns out that you guys know each other. It's too big a coincidence. Paweł Zerka is the lead public opinion analyst at the European Council on Foreign Relations, and we gave him a ring to find out more. So, Paweł, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Your report opens with a comparison between the European Union and the Barbie film, which certainly got my attention. What are the parallels that you see between the EU and Barbie?
It is certainly there in order to grab your attention. I remember the moment when I thought about the parallel. I was traveling from Brazil to Europe, and it's the moment when you have the occasion to catch up on blockbuster movies. But it's also a moment when you can reflect on the European continent from a distance. And I ended up watching Barbie, and I thought, wow, it actually could be a film about Europe as well. In the movie, if you haven't seen it, you have a Barbie who thinks that in the real world, everyone should be proud of her and grateful to her for having liberated girls and helped them feel powerful. But then Barbie gets to the real world and discovers that not only isn't every girl grateful to her, but actually many are angry with Barbie for having forced them to look for perfection and for being so perfect, unlike themselves. And I felt that, especially last year, on the occasion of the European Parliament elections, many people who might think of themselves as pro-European should have felt a similar shock of confronting a real world, because they might have felt that in Europe, everyone should have been grateful for what European Union does. But then when you see the results of the election. Not only just half of the European electorate bothers to go to the voting booths, but also many end up voting for Eurosceptic parties. And I think that this parallel allows us to think about Europe in terms of there is a certain promise that Europe should be capable of satisfying. But as things stand today, something is going wrong with the European project because apparently for many people, what the European Union stands for today doesn't satisfy that promise.
And you talk in your report about 3 specific groups of people who under-participate in the election. They don't feel like it's for them, they don't feel included in it, and they just tend to vote less. So can you tell us who are these 3 groups and what really characterizes them?
Yeah, it's not just the election. So for me, writing this report was an occasion to reflect on what has happened overall over the past 12 months in Europe and what the different events are telling me about the state of what we call European sentiment. And it's largely about the European Parliament elections, but not only. There is war in Ukraine, there is war in Gaza as well. And I think that these are the major events against the background of which you can observe how Europeans feel about Europe. And I felt that one of the important voiceless groups in Europe are people who are non-white, who are Muslim, and who first, on the occasion of the European Parliament elections, often could have felt underrepresented because the candidate list didn't include many people like them. But most of all, the campaign to those elections featured plenty of anti-immigration rhetoric in almost every European member state. The other 2 groups are young Europeans who, on the occasion of the European Parliament elections, very often didn't bother to vote. But also when they did vote, they have no longer any qualms about voting for Eurosceptic or anti-establishment parties, whereas the mainstream parties usually perform quite badly among that group. And finally, I decided to focus on people in Central and Eastern Europe. In many countries from that region, the turnout was below 40%, whereas this happened only in one other country, which is Portugal. Then last year was also the occasion of the 20th anniversary of EU membership for 8 countries of Central and Eastern Europe. But the celebrations of this occasion were quite low-key, which was also kind of telling.
What do you think it's telling of?
I think it's telling of the realization of the political elites that despite the many fruits of EU membership, much of their electorate is actually not that satisfied with the participation in the bloc. Perhaps a couple of years ago, we would say that many people in Central and Eastern Europe feel disappointed by the European Union, humiliated by the EU membership. There are writers like Ivan Krastev who were suggesting this a couple of years ago. Today, the situation is different. I think that in much of Central and Eastern Europe, people actually feel very self-confident about themselves to the point where they feel that actually they don't need that European Union that much. And over the past couple of years, they have felt that they were right on several points, whereas Western Europe was wrong. And then on other occasions that they felt so much different. And namely, I mean the multiculturalism of Western Europe, which is not how many people in Central and Eastern Europe feel their country should look like.
Let's turn to the other group that you identify as under-participating in Europe or not feeling like they have a role to play in it. Young people. So in recent elections in France and Germany especially, there's been a lot of attention paid to the fact that young people are increasingly turning to the far right and voting for parties like the Rassemblement National and the AfD. But is it oversimplistic when we look at Europe as a whole to say that young people are increasingly turning away from the progressive politics that we used to associate them with and turning towards the far right?
Listen, the answer is that we don't know what is happening in the European Union as a whole, because there is very little data on how people in each of the European Union's member states voted in the European elections based on their age. So we have the data from something like half of the European member states, and only a bit of it are official data in the sense of being based on exit polls or similar. So for this paper, I had the luxury of working with 27 researchers, each of them located in a different EU member states. In those countries where we have the data from, young people are no longer concerned about voting for the far right or anti-establishment parties. As you said, this concerns France, Germany. This also happens in Poland, where the far-right Confederacja actually won the youth vote on the occasion of the European Parliament elections. We see similar trends in Spain or Portugal, in Austria and Czech Republic, or in Bulgaria and Romania, where there are quite many people among the young who are voting for parties that are either far-right or simply Eurosceptic. There are some exceptions to the rule. So, for example, Italy, it's a country where the young reject voting for the Eurosceptic right. Even more, the young are the only age group where the Brothers of Italy didn't win. And young Italians clearly prefer to vote for left-wing or radical left parties. Also, in other countries that we mentioned, including France, the picture is surely not homogeneous. The young are happy very often to vote for the far right, but they are also more likely than the older generations to vote for the far left. And this also happens in several other countries where the radical left parties or independent candidates, they very often attract the youth vote. I think, therefore, that it's not simply about European young becoming more right-wingy. Simply, I feel that they don't find the offer by the mainstream parties equally attractive as older generations. And far-right parties or Eurosceptic ones very often are the only ones who try to attract their interest. In France, Jordan Bardella is a young guy. He is very active on social media. The same is the case with the leaders of Confederacja in Poland or AfD in Germany. They are simply trying to talk to young people, very often young men, but other parties are neglecting that group. And they might be neglecting the young because, indeed, that group of voters under 30 represents something like a sixth or a seventh part of the overall European electorate. So it's not a priority. European population is quite old. You would rather focus on the old than on the young. But I think that the young matter because they represent the future, because the way they start voting today, they might bring it to their future as well. That might mean more votes for the far right in the future. And also that there is the current generation of the young. But if the mainstream parties do not wake up, then there will be several generations of the young which find the mainstream offer as unattractive.
What do you think are the threats of not mobilizing the two other groups enough, so non-white Europeans and Central Europeans, and what do you think can be done about this?
I'm talking in the report about three groups, but I feel that they all are connected to a single danger for the European Union, which is about its xenophobic drift. I feel that the voicelessness of non-white and Muslim Europeans will mean that their perspectives are simply not heard in Europe, and it will only allow xenophobia to flourish in European policy, language, and outlook. At the same time, if in Central and Eastern Europe the current ethnocentrism remains unchallenged, then it will only normalize such attitudes in those societies and could also encourage them elsewhere across the EU. And finally, if the young Europeans grow up in such an environment where xenophobia is normalized, some of them might become xenophobic themselves, but others could reject the European Union if they see it as standing for the values that are not theirs. So I think that the non-participation in Europe is a problem. And in order to tackle it, political parties in Europe need to open up to a more ethnoculturally diversified membership and voting base. European institutions need to tackle internal racism within their ranks, and the media need to keep the parties in check on that issue in the same way they are already doing on gender balance, for example. When it comes to the young people, there are promising policy reforms that some countries are testing. Like, for example, on the occasion of those European elections, Germany, Austria, and Belgium reduced the voting age down to 16. Such a reform allowed, for example, young Belgians to pass from representing 17 to 20% of the overall electoral. So it slightly increases their importance, and that might force parties to notice that those voters exist. Then two other things are linked. So one thing is rejecting the ethnic conception of Europeanness, but then the question is, what do you offer in exchange? I call it a civic conception of Europeanness, but I think that European leaders, politicians also need to work a lot on filling such a conception of Europeanness with meaning and with substance. So I'm attached to thinking that Europe should be attractive because it should be seen by people as an area that allows you to experience emancipation and freedom. But currently, many people don't feel about European Union in that way. So I feel that the European mainstream, they need to regain control over the way migration is being debated across the continent. They need to be able to dispel the fears of migration, but also offer policy solutions that would deal with irregular migration, but in a law-abiding manner. And most of all, the way they talk about migration should not use the concepts and the words which are rather characteristic of the far right and xenophobic political forces.
Barbie ultimately has a happy ending. Do you think this story can have a happy ending?
Exactly. So I see that in your podcast, you are looking for hopeful stories. And I realize that much of what I have said so far is pretty hopeless. But I wouldn't be using the metaphor of Barbie if I didn't believe myself that that story could have a happy ending.
I feel like we spent quite a lot of that conversation focused on problems that need fixing. And it is really right to focus on those things. Of course it is. But I do think it's also worth noting that quite a lot of Paweł's report is quite upbeat. It talks about how most Europeans trust the EU and feel optimistic about its future. So all is not lost, but that doesn't mean that there isn't work to do. And I feel like Paweł is really good at articulating some of the really important things that do need fixing. So I'm really glad that he was able to join us today.
Yeah, I also think that it's super important that, at the very end, he raises this idea of just building Europe around a new community that is a civic community rather than this historic community that started Europe. I think it's really important because, first of all, that is a great way to tackle this xenophobia / whiteness that maybe is a bit of a threshold for non-white people or Muslim people to feel really embraced in the community. But also, it's such a concrete way of sort of trying to change the paradigm, which I think is really necessary these days, because even for, the part of the people I understand better, which is Central and Eastern Europeans, there was always this feeling of like knocking on, this glorious Western Europe's door and, maybe being let in one day. Mm-hmm. Whereas that would be really cool if we didn't talk so much about what Europe used to be and who founded it and who's got more merits on their resume, but maybe just like trying to be more open and, build it as it goes. So yeah, I really enjoyed the report and its final thoughts.
Yeah, it is absolutely worth a read. And the link will, of course, be in the show notes. It is recommendation time. Wojciech, what have you been enjoying this week?
I've been enjoying a lot of things, but they all got overshadowed by a recommendation from a longtime friend and collaborator, Alberto Alemano. And he introduced us to a newsletter called The First 1000 Days. No surprise, it's about little kids. And normally being quite overloaded with parenting duties on a daily basis, I'd gently pass. But I got really caught up in the edition Alberto recommended, because it discusses how children raised in multilingual families learn languages. And I found some insights truly fascinating. So I won't spoil all of it to you, just some things. So for example, it cites research stating that babies cry with an accent corresponding to their parents' native languages, which is just mind-blowing.
That is so fascinating. The idea of a baby crying with a German accent.
Yeah, and actually that was the example, that babies crying in German, they have a different intonation than children crying in French.
Wow.
Because German has like a downward, intonation contrary to the French. Mind-blowing. So by the way, I wanted to ask you, because your boy is almost exactly 1 year old. Does he sound more French or British at this stage of his life?
He actually sounds at the moment like he's speaking Arabic.
Arabic.
I don't know where that's come from, because he only hears English and French. But it is really interesting, this question of what his kind of quote unquote native language is going to be. Both, I guess. I mean, the first week of his life, he heard mostly French at the hospital, even from me. And then we spoke English at home for a few months during parental leave. And now he hears French most of the day again at the creche. And you can really hear him experimenting with his voice and trying out new sounds and inflections. But which language is it now? It's really difficult to say.
Yeah, I asked you because this newsletter, it also highlights a video of Ola, a 19-month-old girl who doesn't speak many, if any, words yet, but perfectly reproduces the sound of Scouse. This Liverpudlian accent.
I've seen this video. It's so good.
Yeah, I think we have to play a snippet.
Okay. Oh, really? I'm not Oh, right. Are you tired? I'm not Oh, you're not tired?
So yeah, anyway, the newsletter isn't just about language though. It's a collection of very insightful short stories covering a wide variety of parental struggles and raising vital questions like, these are some of my favorites. Should you vacation without your kids?
Yes.
I think I know the answer. And how to fight less with your kids at home.
Oh.
That's my bedtime read tonight, hopefully. So yeah, it's the first 1000 days newsletter. We'll leave a link to it in our show notes.
Excellent.
So what have you been enjoying, Katie?
I wanted to recommend a book which comes out today, in fact, but which I've been able to read already. The Perks of Being a Podcaster. The book is called How Libraries Thrive. And it is a celebration of the magic of libraries that's been put together by the European Cultural Foundation. How often do you go to the library, Woidke?
Quite often, actually. I use it as a free co-working space because my local library has a very, very cozy co-working space. And also, my son just reads all the time. So we go to the kids' department of the library.
Yeah, I have to say that I'm someone who hasn't really used public libraries that much as an adult. I used to go a lot when I was a kid, and I'm going a lot again now that I have a kid. But I'm feeling kind of sad about all those years when I didn't go, because they are these incredible public spaces. They're one of the best kinds of public space that we've managed to create as a species, frankly. And this book celebrates loads of cool things that libraries do around Europe, beyond simply lending you books. Things like helping Ukrainian veterans, helping prisoners, doing these living book events where scientists and other interesting people can come to the library and you get to consult them like they're a human book. Anyway, this book is a really, really nice reminder of just how lucky we are to have libraries. So I really recommend that you check it out. It is out today and you will find a link in the show notes. It is happy ending time. It's normally Dominic's job to fill us with joy at the end of the podcast. So, Woidke, what have you got for us?
So yeah, I'm here, but Dominic's spirit is with us because he sent me a perfect story for this happy ending. Sorry, I'm trying to just tell it with a straight face.
Okay.
It's not easy. So the story goes like this. I'm going to bring you back to 1970s Romania.
Okay.
So there was an old lady in Romania who a very long time ago found a pretty stone in the Colții stream in southeast Romania. It was a nice looking stone. So she decided to use it as a doorstep in her small cottage. And, over the years, many feet touched the stone, even the feet of some burglars who broke into her home, stealing all of her gold jewelry.
Oh, no.
And then, sadly, in 1991, the lady passed away, and the house was inherited by one of her relatives. And one day, this relative took a closer look at the stone and thought it looked rather unusual. So he decided to bring it to a local museum. And there it was determined that it's one of the largest amber nuggets in the world.
Wow.
Valued at around €1 million.
What?
Yeah, exactly. So the stone was then sent to various laboratories to confirm its type and age, and it was eventually verified as authentic amber, weighing around 3.5 kilograms, which is like 8 pounds, and estimated to be between 38.5 and 70 million years old.
Whoa, my God, that is so old.
Yeah.
That is crazy. Because like amber is solidified like tree goo, right? So there's probably some like really, really, really old bugs trapped in that thing.
Yeah. And then I read that the region is famous for, having a lot of amber nuggets there. But this one was really, off limits. So basically, that's the end of the story. Kudos to the granny. That's how we build some intergenerational wealth.
Do you know who I feel really sad for? Is the burglars who took her jewelry, but like walked straight past €1 million.
Maybe it was just dark. They didn't see it was glimmering or something.
You know what? I don't feel like we should waste our sympathy on the burglars. Oh, thank you for joining me this week, Woidke. This has been a lot of fun.
Pleasure is mine. Thank you so much.
The show was produced this week by Woidke himself, along with Morgan Childs in Prague. Thank you both. Next week, Dominic will be back, and I think the show is headed onto a boat. I'll leave you with that intriguing detail. I hope it's enough to make you tune in.
In the meantime, you can find us on social media networks such as, and now I'm going to be really bad at it, I'm sure we're on Instagram.
We are.
We still have a Twitter account that is now called X, and I really can't be bothered to visit this platform because it's just so terrible. Every time I open it, there's Elon Musk just jumping at me, so I just can't. Then we are on Mastodon, I guess, sometimes.
Yeah. That one's surprisingly nice. People should go there.
Yeah, Mastodon is really good. And
Threads.
Oh, Threads. We're still there. Threads.
Yeah, but it's not really a thing.
Yeah, but you can really just email us. That's the best way to connect with us. We're just so old. Emails are good.
Do that. hello@europeanspodcast.com.
Do zobaczenia.
Bye.